the 350Z the next 240SX? I'm starting to think about this as of recently, going to a drift event and noticing there were more 350Zs at this event than there were S chassis competing. So my question is the 350Z going to have the same impact on car culture in the car community that the S chassis did? So for this video, I'm going to bring up reasons why I think so, some counter arguments to that, and I'd like it if you guys also pitch in the comments below. We can have a discussion down below. Now we'll try to have a mature discussion down below, but it is the YouTube comment section, so it's fair game for anything, really. We're going into this thinking the 350Z is going to have the same impact and replace what the 240SX does, but we're not looking at this as if it is an actual S chassis vehicle at heart. It isn't. It's a Z car. The S chassis is an S chassis. We're going to be discussing, though, the similarities they have and if the Z33 is going to have the same impact as the S chassis. Now, to start things off, the S chassis and drifting go hand in hand. You can't think of one without thinking of the other. And like I said earlier in the video, Z33s are starting to dominate the drift scene. So what do these two platforms have in common, making them popular? They are cheap. Z33s are starting to get to the point where you could find a decent one, average mileage, for about $5,000. Now in around 2010, right at the beginning of the drift tax, where some would be drift taxed and some wouldn't, you could find a clean 240SX with, you know, an average amount of miles in a decent condition for around $3,000, or inflation included, about $3,500 in today's money. Now, the 350Z hasn't gotten that cheap yet, but they're well on their way there. You can find rebuilt Title 1s or salvage Title 1s for about that cost. But right now, the 03 models, the early year DEs, are getting to that point of about $5,000, maybe $4,500 to $5,000. And I'm sure with due time, they will hit about $3,000 for a decent example of a 350Z. To add to the cost argument, the cars are relatively affordable to maintain. The VQ35 is quite a reliable engine, and so is the KA24DE. Parts are quite frequent for them. Those engines were used in a lot of different Nissan platforms, so the VQ's been used on the Nissan Quest and, you know, the Maximas and Altimas. And the KA24 has also been used in the Altima. It's been used in the D21 pickup. And that just goes to show that the engines and parts are frequently available. They're always laying around somewhere, or the parts store is always going to have something you need because of the frequency of availability. Both cars are Nissans. Plain and simple. Let's talk about the chassis between the two platforms. So, it's obvious they're both front-engine, rear-wheel drive vehicles. They are easy to slide, and now this is anecdotal to claim, but a lot of 350Z owners that slide them, and a lot of S chassis owners that slide them, will tell you the cars are probably one of the simpler cars to get into for drifting. They're more forgiving, they're a little easier to slide and control. One reason for this is their weight balance. They both have similar weight distribution, a little more over the front axle than the rear. The other thing is their wheelbase. So, if your wheelbase is too short, like a Miata, for example, it's really twitchy on transitions. And if your wheelbase is really long, like a SC300, it's harder to initiate. But the S chassis is right in the middle. An S14 is about 99 inches in wheelbase, and the Z33 is 104 inches in wheelbase. So there's about a 5-inch difference. So why are they praised for their wheelbase being a good mix for drifting? And I bring the point up, if you compare the ratio of their wheelbase to the track width of the rear, the S chassis, S14 S chassis, has a ratio of 1.7, and the 350Z has a ratio of 1.72, making that dynamic very similar. A lot of the cars either came with open diffs or viscous limited slips. Now, for the S chassis, finding the viscous limited slip option is a lot more difficult, but in respect to drifting, it's going to be welded anyway. So for a moment, let's not talk about drifting and talk about their chassis still. Now, with their weight distribution, I feel these cars still take a similar line driving them. Now, driving around town, they're pretty sedate and boring, nothing fancy there. But when you get them into an environment where you can really load up the suspension and really push the car, it feels like they do share some similar characteristics. Turning in, if your turn-in's incorrect, the car will want to push, so you need to set up properly, maybe a little bit of trail brake into the corner, and power out right past your apex, and that's how both cars really respond well to going fast around a corner. Now, to argue this, the S chassis is significantly lighter, ranging from 500 to 600 pounds to maybe even 700 pounds lighter than the Z33, depending on trim level, gear, stuff like that, etc. But the Z has a more sophisticated suspension setup, so it can deliver more mechanical grip. So there's a balance to these things. All right, let's talk about the power plants both of these have. Now, before you start writing your death threat comments to me, in the end, they're both going to be swapped with either an LS or a JZ, so... But to compare the two power plants, I know one's a 6-cylinder and the other's a 4-cylinder, but what they offer are, you know, a very great mid-range, but they aren't extremely fast or powerful or going to win races. Kind of like, you know, the B-Series back in the 90s would smoke a KA engine with simple bolt-ons. And same thing with modern cars. The VQ, you put bolt-ons on it, it does okay, doesn't really do much. You really got to boost it or do a lot of work to get the most out of it. Now, there is the HR engine, and that's why I also bring in the SR20 in the S chassis. The SR20, because it's so common to find them already swapped and it's so easy to swap, I'm considering this one of the engines that it came with, especially in Japan, or if you're out of the US. In the S chassis, life started with a single jingle KA24E, made about 130 horsepower. Then after 2 years, they were updated with a dual overhead cam variant of the engine. And then lastly, there is the SR that could be swapped in. We can also talk about the CA engine, but I'm just going to leave it with the SR for now, for simplicity. The Z, on the other hand, started out with the regular DE engine, made 287 horsepower, was then updated with the rev-up engine, and then was completely updated with the HR engine. So I like to think of the single overhead cam KA to the regular DE, the dual overhead cam KA to the rev-up, and the SR20 to the HR. Now, the original KAs don't do very well with bolt-ons until you start to boost them and do more work to them, and that's just like the DE variants, both the regular DE and the rev-up. But the HR responds to bolt-ons well, and so does the SR20. Also, to add to this, both communities argue all the time about what engine's better for whatever reason, but I don't think the S chassis community is as cancerous as the Z community. But regardless of what power plant it is, it's enough to work with for whatever you're going to do, especially if we're going to go back to drifting so frequently. You got enough power to slide and do well at a drift event and link up all the corners. Both cars are pretty reliable, let's be honest. They can take some beatings. You can beat them on the track on the weekend and drive them to work on Monday. You can thrash them all day and they'll just beg for more. Now, S chassis are getting the stigma of being unreliable, but honestly, that's because they've been so abused and neglected and gone through so many hands of different owners that they're getting destroyed. And it's not the car's fault, it's not an engineering fault, it's just the way the car is being treated now. And it's starting to happen with the Z a little bit. You do start to see some of those cheaper ones that have been abused, neglected, you know, ran out of oil, etc. People destroying them like that. But if you take care of either or, you can beat them all day and they do just fine. Which is also why the S chassis was such a popular platform to begin with. So this wouldn't be an intellectual debate unless we brought up some counter arguments. So one thing to consider is S chassis were disposable when they came out. They were a cheap sports car, and when they started hitting the used market, they were treated as a disposable sports car, disposable cheap sports car. So people got them and didn't put much care into them because it was a cheap car to begin with. It wasn't much of a financial investment to begin with. Z cars, on the other hand, the Z cars have a long lineage and a lot of history behind them. So there's a lot of enthusiasts that are enthusiastic about Z cars in general. And people buy these cars and they take great care of them from the get-go. The difference between the S chassis and the Z chassis is you'll always find that old guy who's taking care of his Z car from new. The S chassis, that's hard to find. But with a Z car, you'll always find it whatever generation it is, albeit a Z32 or Z33. The Z has more power. We talked about it a little earlier with engines, but the Z has more power. I mean, 150 horsepower versus 300 horsepower. I mean, both stock are enough to start sliding and drifting and enough to work with, but let's face it, that's the difference they do have. The Z car will also be used for track days and canyon cruising. S chassis, I feel like 90% of the people that are sought out to buy one want them for drifting. And I could see a lot more people getting into the Z chassis for drifting only, but there's still going to be people that want to track them or want them for cruising around town and in the canyon. And it's kind of a shame because the S chassis does those two things really good as well. They're just not used for that, which is unfortunate. And I mean, NASA even created a spec Z class just for the Z33 chassis. None of the S chassis got that. The Z car has had a lot more attention put into its creature comforts as well. So the S chassis was, like I said, it was a cheap sports car back when it came out. It was supposed to be really affordable for young people to buy and have fun with. The Z car, on the other hand, is more of a grand tourer. Leather heated seats, nice sound systems, airbags everywhere so they don't die. I mean, the S chassis had HiKIS in a very few select models, and they had power seat belts. That's cool, right? They don't work half the time, but you tried. So future predictions, what do I think is going to happen to the Z chassis? I feel it's going to have the same impact for the next generation that the S chassis had for our generation and older generations. It's going to be a sought-out car. They're going to get really cheap. People are going to buy them up, and they're going to get wrapped around poles, wrecked, damaged, you know, destroyed, and thrashed on. I think most Z33s are going to have a similar life to the S chassis did. What's going to happen? They're going to get wrecked, like I said earlier. They're going to get thrashed on. They're going to get cheap. Eventually, the drift tax will kick in on these cars as well. Once they start to get more sought out and harder to find, then a lot of them will be abused and destroyed, and finding a clean example, a well-conditioned example of this car is going to merit some more value in it. So I think if you have your heart desired on one of these as a nice car, as not something to beat on and thrash, I think you should start looking now and start looking in the next couple years and buy one. So let me know what you guys think down below. If you guys think the same, or if you guys think otherwise, let's have a discussion down below, or just go ahead and talk trash about my driving style. I blame the chemtrails. Anyway guys, thanks for watching.